Hello, welcome to another episode of Older Than I Look, featuring me, Lizzy Co. If you tuned in for the previous episode, things got pretty intense, so I thought we could use a later one this time. With that said, it's 1995, you're 8 years old, and it's time to go to the mall. We have 4 stops to make: Toys R Us, Claire's, Radio Shack, and the record shop. So, take your seat in the back right of that fresh silver Chevy Lumina in the driveway. Your older brother is already riding shotgun, and Dad is in the driver's seat blasting the Allman Brothers. Mom is back in the house taking a break from everyone on the couch, so let's roll. The mall culture of the 80s didn't make its way up to rural northern Vermont until the early 90s. We were always pretty behind the times, the way most small towns are. If you also grew up in the country, please tell me in the comments about a time when you realized your town was also late to the game. One example I have is I remember that 90s grunge fashion was still alive and well into the 2000s up where I lived. So by the time I was a little kid, we were just hitting the high notes of 80s shopping culture. I remember the local pop radio station holding a contest to name the sparkling new mall being built in my hometown. They ended up going with the Diamond Run Mall, named in a skiing theme after our main industry at the time. I grew up at the base of Killington, Smuggler's Notch, and dozens of other smaller ski mountains, but my family didn't actually have enough money to go enjoy the facilities. We looked up at the mountains and wondered instead. The mall had a ton of giant skylights, which meant a lot to us northerners, who hardly ever got enough sun, especially in the winter months. The food court was right underneath a lot of them, so it was a great place to find a warm, sunny spot and relax with food you'd never eat at home. Everything it served was enormous. The pretzels were the size of my face, the pizza slices were a quarter of the whole pizza, and they reached the length of my forearm. The mall itself, however, wasn't so giant. It was only 1 story high simply because the number of shoppers in that area could only support so many storefronts. This meant it didn't have any escalators to ride, but it did have a cool water feature like all classic malls must have. I couldn't find a vintage picture from back when it looked great, but here's what state it's in these days now that time and graffiti have taken their toll. Based on the eye bags and the wistful half smile, I'm guessing this is a fellow millennial. I remember how the parking lot stretched like the ocean. I couldn't believe how many people they expected to show up. Did we even have that many folks in the entire state? It felt like a dream or a movie. Inside, it was shiny metal, those big skylights, and different music and smells pulsing from each store. It was a tilt-a-whirl inside a jukebox. So stop number 1, Toys R Us. They had constant ads on TV and in the newspaper, and I felt important because something that came in the Sunday paper was actually for me. I read the ad circular like it was my own newspaper, and I marveled at all the toys I had never seen before, except for sometimes at friends' houses, usually friends whose parents drove minivans and had Capri Suns in the fridge. If that doesn't sound luxurious to you, then you grew up rich, kid. I loved the crinkle of the shiny newsprint. It was heavy with colorful ink, and it was so much more interesting to hold and look at than my parents' boring newspaper with its matte gray pages and grainy black ink that came off on my fingers. Other highlights of the big Sunday paper bundle were the color cartoons, which came in their own section just for me, and the crossword, which was large enough to keep me busy for the whole Sunday and into Monday. Also, it was printed right next to Dear Abby's columns, so I got to learn about petty interpersonal drama, even though watching Springer was just not allowed in our house. This was mostly because the idea of family actually confronting each other was way too threatening to my mother's iron grip on the family, so that kind of programming tended not to be allowed on screen for very long before we shifted back to something with a more conservative message. I thought the bold naming of the problem was thrilling and shocking. I wanted more. Scandals,
set shopping display. Keep the wheels spinning, turning no page. Let's talk about.
But yeah, that crinkly paper, though. I can't overemphasize how tactile the world was back in the 90s. Phones had buttons. Sometimes they were hard plastic, but other times they were soft, squishy silicone. Lights were these big, clicky switches. Doors had long handles that went ka-chunk, or knobs that were die-cast into interesting textures and shapes. People who could afford doorbells had a button on them that sank down really satisfyingly. Otherwise, you just banged on the front door to ask to come in. We went to the grocery store instead of having delivery as an easy option. So we spent time touching each item. We were examining, reaching up and bending down, and snapping coupons out of the dispensers along the aisles, eating samples from the bakery, and drinking the free coffee from the machine right at the front of the store that always smelled so great. This is not to say that automating things is bad. It makes the world much more accessible than it used to be, and folks like me who get tired easily can actually participate in the world still. I actually love grocery delivery now because it helps me avoid all the triggers in the grocery store, so I can just save my energy for more meaningful things than processing a meltdown. But before my brain got rewired by CPTSD, I did enjoy all the sensory delights of going shopping.
Today is you, but tomorrow's him. We look at Bob, pretend for the song.
I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid, was the jingle that I didn't super identify with. I didn't get to go on shopping sprees I saw on TV. I wanted to grow up so I could have the money and control and buy the cool stuff I saw on TV. This would later manifest in a pretty bad compulsive spending habit in my 20s that landed me in some serious credit card debt that I definitely regret. But when you grow up watching your parents spend their cash down to zero to pay the bills, you assume it's natural to drain the account each month. And if there's more in there at the end of the month, then hey, it's time for a treat. I understand now that this is terribly irresponsible financial planning, and I've learned how to handle my business since then, thank goodness. But it would have been so cool if I had gotten to learn it right the first time.
Let's work it out.
Speaking of 4 ways to invest your money at this toy store, let's talk Beanie Babies. These were animal-shaped plush beanbags, essentially. Each one came with a name and a short poem about itself on a heart-shaped tag on its ear. There were always new ones coming out in limited editions. They were just made to take your money the same way that Stanley and Awala are doing it now with the water bottles. And I respect it. I loved the weight of them and the soft velvety texture and all the rich colors they came in. It was really wonderful for me as a kid. And so I went hunting around town for them with my best friend under the supervision of her super easygoing dad with his big black Suburban that we would sit in the way back in and just have a great time. And every time I convinced my parents to get me one, I felt normal for a little while, like a regular kid who had regular kid things to talk about instead of war stories from mom and farm stories from dad, neither of which anybody seemed to really care about. Unfortunately, adults started getting into collecting and reselling the rarer Beanie Babies for a huge profit, and they became sort of a precursor to Bitcoin investors or NFT investors. And there was a short-term spike in the resale value of these rarer beanies, but they didn't end up being a solid long-term investment, and a lot of people lost their money. So, even if we end up leaving Toys R Us on our trip empty-handed today, we still have the lesson it taught me, which is don't get sucked in by the limited editions. The limited editions are never-ending, but your bank account absolutely does have a limit. Also, stick to more traditional investments when you have the extra cash to be thinking about investing in the first place.
Situation, the hood you never been in, now you turn to religion, but hip-hop's the way to live it. Image that you stop, you got your static alive, so don't be shy.
Speaking of places to spend your extra cash, our next stop is Claire's, the 90s girl accessory wonderland. It was an assault on the senses. Every surface was mirrored, and the small girls spritz testing sugary perfumes all day meant there was a perma-cloud of cotton candy stink in the air. I loved it.
And we gonna find you. Yeah.
I went with my dad more than my mom, which was weird to my friends, but normal for me. Mom was just always too tired to go do fun stuff, so dad was the one for the weekend adventures. It didn't bother me because that was how things had been for as long as I could remember. But yeah, Claire's felt like this wonderland of instruction on how to be a girl, which I was kind of struggling with since I didn't understand I was non-binary back then. So it felt like a relief to be able to walk in there and know that anything I chose would be acceptably girly enough for me not to attract any unwanted attention as a tomboy, which is how they labeled baby queers like me back in the day.
Headlines and hypocrisy, scandals that shock and dismay. Keep the wheels spinning, turning.
Dad bought me tons of keychains. My backpack was absolutely dripping. Uh, and one day I even came home with this cheap rhinestone bracelet. It was meant to look like rubies and diamonds. But when I showed it to my mom and I joked that my dad had taken me to Munsats, this is before it became Diamonds and More, I I made this joke that we went to Munsats while we were out, and my mom got this weird look on her face, like she was taking me seriously and maybe getting jealous. So I really quickly had to reassure her that it was just like some cheap bracelet from Claire's before she could start raging. Seemed like it was a big deal. Claire's even offered ear piercing, but even as a kid, I knew that getting my ears pierced at the mall by a teenager using one of those little guns was a recipe for disaster, which I think is the lesson we'll take with us from our time at Claire's. That and the knowledge that a shiny little treat can sometimes be just the thing. Now we come to stop number 3, Radio Shack. This was more my brother's stop. It wasn't very interesting to me. They sold a lot of electronics parts I didn't really understand, and they had expensive stuff on shelves up high I wasn't allowed to touch. But my dad did his best. He tried to point out things to me and offer them to me that did seem relevant to my interests while my brother was poring over transistors. And he pointed out things to me that were hands-on that I could control, and I really liked that. One thing was a little pink radio with a single earphone with a cord, because we're in the 90s, everything has cords. And I used that to listen to the golden age hip-hop my local pop station was playing a lot those days. Side note, the first album I knew and loved was actually The Carnival by Wyclef Jean, which is completely inappropriate for a young child, but that's what happens when you have older siblings. The radio played that album's single, Gone Till November, all the time, and I just couldn't get enough. I loved that my radio was little and pink, so girly, appropriate for me, it had to be girly, and had a wrist strap so I could carry it around with me, and it was just so much cuter than the bulky gray radio I had in my bedroom, although the speaker was better on the big one. I listened alone at night when I couldn't sleep. I'd put on the station that played ballads, and Whitney and Mariah and Celine would sing me to sleep. The music helped me calm down, but I still felt fidgety in a way that wouldn't really be soothed until like decades later when I discovered weighted blankets, medication, therapy, etc. Speaking of things that calmed my anxious heart, let's talk about my other discovery at Radio Shack, my little remote control dinosaur. Also had a cord because it's the 90s. Everything had cords. Wireless wasn't a thing yet. I brought my little dinosaur into kindergarten show and tell, and I proudly brought it to life in front of my class. I thought it was so cool that I could like exert my tiny will on the dino from a distance, and I didn't feel much other control in my life at that point, so it was a real rush. So Radio Shack taught me that I might have more influence than I think, but I have to be patient and look out for my moments because opportunity is tall, but it is narrow.
Let's work it out.
Okay, let's hop in the time machine and skip ahead a little bit to 1999 when Gone Till November wasn't playing on the radio anymore and grunge and boy bands were competing for the #1 spot in the top 40. We come to our final stop, Strawberries. Strawberries was a New England chain of record stores. They were all over the place in my state. And but once CDs became common enough, the CD burners were affordable for the masses. I got most of my music by trading burned copies of albums with my friends. I learned about Alanis Morissette and Jagged Little Pill from a friend, and it was like being able to see a color I'd never seen before. She was so sassy and angry and beautiful, and she made fun of men for acting so important and for putting women down. I heard her just reading people to filth, and I learned that naming what's happening in front of me could be revolutionary and piss everybody off. If Mariah Carey was perfume and flowers, Alanis was a messy bun and a middle finger. There was a lot of conversation about her body in the video for Thank You, and I learned through that the amount of skin I covered or showed wasn't just a response to the weather, but some sort of political statement. She was only 21 when Jagged Little Pill came out, but she seemed so wise and powerful to me. When I heard her song Perfect, I came to understand that that standard was unreasonable and I was living under ridiculous conditions. I had just never heard it laid out so clearly by someone else, and it repulsed me to hear it out loud. It meant so much more that I discovered that song through a mix CD a friend made for me. So mostly what I had gotten from Strawberries, however, was my boy band tapes, the other obsession. I listened to the Backstreet Boys debut cassette so many times that I actually did wear it out. They just seemed so much softer and sweeter than the boys and men that I grew up around, who all wore camel pants and they smelled like cow manure from their farms. I always liked the softest, most femme-looking member of the band, and I didn't really understand that was, again, because I was a little baby queer. For example, Nick Carter and Justin Timberlake were both the youngest members of their groups, and they both had this masked lesbian aesthetic that, at the time, even though they were cisgender guys, they still looked like masked lesbians, and I found that appealing. So mostly Strawberries showed me, through all of its sections, that there were so many different worlds to explore that there couldn't just be one right way to think or enjoy things. It had to be okay for me to just like what I liked, which for me happened to be queer-looking guys and revolutionary women. And honestly, not much has changed. This episode was just part 1, so please stay tuned for part 2 when we'll explore the world of the mall once puberty really hits and hormones are calling the shots. Thanks so much for watching or listening today. I'll see you next time.
You don't gotta get all crazy.
There won't be no music in that, just be me talking.
Is it rolling?
Oh.